welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to this webinar on the Nomcom review, the assessment report that has been published last week by the analysis group. I pasted a link here in the chat as well for you in case you haven't seen the report or you would like to access it during or after the webinar. Feel free to do so. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to the analysis group who will lead you through the presentation and also will take question and answers afterwards, of course. And I might take it back at the end for a quick reminder of the continuous public consultation process that will take place over the next 2 weeks. And with that, I'll pass it over to Greg Rafford, I believe. Over to you, Greg.
Great, thank you, Lars. I think, all right, now I'm seeing our report. Awesome, appreciate it. So thank you everyone for joining today. We appreciate your time and look forward to your feedback and questions. Just to give you a brief outline of our agenda for this call, we'll give you a brief introduction to ourselves. We'll then kind of delve into the scope and the design of this review to assess the strengths and the weaknesses of the Nomcom and think about what recommendations might be forthcoming. Andrew will then, Unger, who's here with me, a colleague of mine, will then provide a summary of the interviews and the surveys that we conducted. We'll then jump into the assessment report findings if you haven't had a chance to review those yet, and then talk about next steps and take questions. So this probably doesn't come as much of a surprise, but we've been hired as the independent examiner to review the Nomcom. And the combination of myself, William Brown, who's on the phone, Mark Engel, who unfortunately I think is currently on a flight, and Andrew Unger really bring to this a lot of kind of deep practical experience in thinking about and analyzing nonprofits, including volunteer-based organizations like ICANN, thinking about their governance structures, and in particular, based on this knowledge and experience, thinking about what changes could be made to improve organizational performance. Andrew, do you want to give a brief introduction to yourself and then Will, and then I'll kind of go from there?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Andrew Unger. I'm a manager here at Analysis Group. I have an MBA from the University of Chicago, concentrating in economics and managerial and organizational behavior. And I've worked on a number of sort of projects for Analysis Group related to corporate governance and similar sort of finance issues.
Hello, everybody. This is Will Brown. I'm a professor at Texas A&M University. I've been studying and working about nonprofit organizations and governance for about the last 20 years, and worked with Mark Engel on a number of different instances. Mark's a little bit more of applied, where he does quite a bit of stuff in trade and professional associations. He actually runs a firm managing and overseeing something odd 30 trade and professional associations, and does quite a bit of consulting and governance work, just to give you his background as well. Greg, I think back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Will. This is Greg. I'm a vice president at Analysis Group. I've been with the firm almost 10 years now, and have done a number of other kind of prior reviews with ICANN, as well as some corporate governance work at Analysis Group. So I'd like to now jump into the scope and design of our review. And I want to go through these slides relatively quickly so that we can spend a bit more time on our results, but in particular, give you all a chance to ask questions and respond to your feedback. So at a really high level, the purpose of our independent review of the Nomcom is to determine whether the Nomcom has a continuing presence within the ICANN structure, to get a sense for how effectively or not it performs its role and purpose. And then we also look at the extent to which the Nomcom is accountable, or once again not, to the wider ICANN community, and if it perhaps isn't, should it be in certain ways. There are a number of criteria that were on our minds as we were developing the interview and kind of talking with individuals, and when we developed the survey. And I just listed a couple of those up here. So we looked at the fulfillment of the mission, adherence to policies. We were particularly interested in accountability and transparency. That was certainly something that came out in the interviews from time to time. we looked at both the composition of the Nomcom itself, but then the composition or the types of people that it was putting forth to the board and the other SOs and ACs. We spent a fair amount of time thinking about the extent to which the communication between the Nomcom and other parts of the ICANN community was effective. And we also spent some of our time thinking about evaluating and measuring outcomes of the Nomcom, such as whether or not it kind of has the processes to identify skills needed by the bodies to which it's appointing people. So in terms of the project design, we've put this together as a two-step process, and we're really still largely in phase one, I would say. So, this is the assessment. So this is kind of the fact-finding portion of our mission. And to get a complete picture of the Nomcom and people's views of the Nomcom, we first started with a thorough review of kind of relevant bylaws, ICANN policies, other documents that were available via ICANN. We then, once we had kind of that baseline level of knowledge, we then developed an interview instrument. We interviewed people, approximately 60, at ICANN 59 and ICANN 60, and also remotely. Based on those interviews and the things that we learned, we then developed a survey instrument. And really the purpose of that was to allow for broader input into the process. And then based on everything that we learned from the interviews, the surveys, and our document review, as well as talking with members of ICANN staff and the Nomcom Review Working Party, we put together an assessment report that summarizes our findings, which is what we're talking about today. We're very excited to get feedback from the ICANN community and anyone else who's interested in providing feedback. Once we've got that and had a chance to think about integrating it into our findings and potentially altering some of the discussion, we'll then put together our recommendations, which is phase two. And there we'll once again provide a report for public comment. Taking those public comments under consideration, we'll then publish a final recommendations report. Sorry, my mouse is stuck a little bit somehow, so apologies for the movement. It's interesting. All right, sorry about that. I think just one item that's worth noting is that we've been working closely with both ICANN staff and the RWP. They've been very helpful in getting us in touch with the right people for both interviews and surveys. They've also made sure that any misunderstandings we might have had about the way parts of ICANN work have been kind of quickly cleared up so that we can really focus on bringing our expertise in organizational management and performance to bear on the project. And I think the one thing that's just worth noting at the very end of the slide is this coordination is not at all affecting our independence. We're still kind of keeping our independence lens on throughout all this process, even though we have been working with ICANN staff and the RWP. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to Andrew now.
So to give you a sense of the timing on these 60 interviews or so that we conducted, about 30 of them were done at ICANN 59. A few more were conducted between ICANN 59 and 60, then more at ICANN 60, and then a few since then. And that, stretching that out allowed us to sort of go in with an initial set of questions based on preliminary discussions and what we had reviewed, and then sort of refine that and identify additional people to speak with. In terms of who we interviewed, we obviously prioritized people with knowledge, interest, who had diversity of perspectives. In some cases, for example, this would mean seeking out additional interviewees, say, based on gender or geography. And of course, we took recommendations from interviewees and RWP members. For example, they might say during an interview, oh, this person had a lot of interesting thoughts or expressed a lot of good ideas to me, and so you should interview them. And so we took those under consideration and reached out. The interviews were semi-structured and a little less than an hour, and really reflected a wide range of topics, from the purpose and effectiveness to size, structure, and transparency. We encourage them to really give us both what went well, what doesn't go well, and their thoughts for improving the Nomcom. In particular, the asking for suggestions is a way, even if this is the assessment phase, to really try and understand why a particular person holds the perspective that they do. And rather just getting that it was good or bad, we really wanted to understand why and where they were coming from. In terms of the interviewees, this is a breakdown of affiliation within ICANN or roles. You'll note, for example, in this case that one might look at, say, GNSO and think or wonder if they are slightly underrepresented relative to the rest of the interviewees. We'll see in a moment that a lot of these sort of issues get worked out when we look at survey responses, and that the GNSO representation there was better. Gender composition for interviewees, probably not surprising at ICANN, but we did take efforts to reach out and get more women into our sample. Here are the regions. Once again, North America is slightly overrepresented, with Africa perhaps underrepresented. We'll see again in the survey that it's a much more balanced. So that's another good point. The survey received 85 completed responses. It was informed by about 40 interviews, and so we had done a number of interviews. We formed our survey, we refined it with the RWP, and then it went live. And as we got feedback, we then conducted additional interviews based on what we were seeing in the survey. And of course, the survey was promoted by ICANN and RWP members. These are the roles within ICANN. It's a little difficult to see, but GNSO is right here. So much better representation here. Again, this is the gender breakdown. And for the region in which they reside, again here, North America and Africa are a little bit more imbalanced. And so I think overall, through the survey and the interviewees, we certainly felt as if we had hit sort of a saturation point where we were hearing many of the same things over and over again and didn't feel as if talking to many new people would really improve our understanding of the Nomcom or lead to different recommendations at that stage. And now I'm going to hand it off to Will.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I'll let you guys keep clicking through those. So first slide here, Nomcom skills and experience. So this is talking about the Nomcom members and thinking about the extent to which that they have the necessary skills to be able to perform the functions that are necessary. Sort of two main things came up in what we found, and this is a combination between the surveys and between the interviews and our observations. One area is it's quite difficult for Nomcom members to fully understand what it takes to be an effective board member, especially of a complex organization like ICANN. It's quite a bit to that, and even as we move forward, that could be a continuing area of concern as the organization is quite complex and quite a lot to it. Second area of skills or experience that the committee seemed to lack or didn't have quite as much familiarity with was in reference to recruiting and selecting, the sort of recruiting and selecting process. How is it that you go through something like this? What are sort of good practices? There was quite a bit of variety in reference to the way that members had done things like this, and certainly in a complex setting. The next slide, if you guys click through there, sort of shows sort of reinforcement from the survey data. That very first set there about knowledge of the board is one of the most important things that Nomcom members need, and this was an area where they could improve. Next slide is looking at independence and effectiveness of the Nomcom and the Nomcom members. One of the areas of concern or that came up was in reference to the extent to which Nomcom members are independent and really are able to prioritize the sort of global internet community as opposed to sort of feeling as a representative of the group that had appointed them or placed them onto the committee. There were a variety of different comments around this. Some people felt like at times that committee members might align to vote in a particular way toward a different set, or that they were there to advance the agenda from the group that they were appointed by. And it's a pretty important principle that the Nomcom seeks independence, both in the appointees and in the individuals that are serving in the committee. And this came up as a concern and something to try and think about. The second area here in reference to effectiveness, generally the committee was perceived to be effective. You can click to the next slide where it has this sort of some of the results from the survey. Where the second bar there is effective, the very first ones on the left indicating a very effective and effective. But there was clearly some room for improvement. This sort of reflects that the Nomcom is able in the end of the process, is able and generally able to find good candidates both for the support organization and for the board. But there was also some sense that there were a number of, or there were potentially good candidates that weren't necessarily being identified. So amongst the pool, they would get good people, but that there was also ways that they could do better, and they could be identifying some of the other individuals that potentially had been missed. And so there was a general sense that there's room for improvement. Yeah, you can go on to the next one. Another key finding was in reference to continuity, and some of this has to do with the importance of how the Nomcom is structured and functions, in the sense that there's some degree of confidentiality. There is confidentiality and some desire to limit communication between one Nomcom committee and another. The general consensus was that the process by which the Nomcom makes decisions, or sort of rules, bylaws, or procedures, should be more open, and that's something that can be shared. So since 2013, there's been a better job of sort of transferring that information between one committee to the next, although it clearly could be better, and we saw this quite a bit when we were observing the committee. There was quite a bit of discussion about some process procedures, and it wasn't always clear that the committee was making improvements with the extent of trying to improve the process, or whether there was just preferences about some of these procedures and how maybe to carry them out. So it wasn't always clear that best practice was guiding the recommendations about how to change processes in the instance that they were, and clearly a better job of sort of managing the knowledge of how this was done and when it was done in the past from one committee to the next could be improved. Last area I'll chat about here is in reference to the communication with other ICANN groups. So this came up quite a bit, that there was inconsistency in the messages that was provided to the Nomcom from the different groups, and there was some struggle amongst how the groups, the supporting organizations, the board itself, was able to communicate with the Nomcom in reference to articulating their preferences or the criteria that would be important. This came up as well when thinking about which individuals could be or should be or might be the preference of the group to have the Nomcom reappoint, and that wasn't always able to be communicated as well. I think that does pretty good. Andrew, do you pick up these from here on, or am I keep going?
Yep. So
Okay.
for the recruiting process, it may not surprise anyone that both the recruiting and the evaluation showed similar distributions in terms of the responses to whether they were effective or not that we just saw for the Nomcom overall. For this, in terms of this first bullet about being effective, what we heard generally focused on diversity and whether that can be increased, with a number of people noting that the pool that been much more diverse along gender lines recently. With respect to the role of OB, the opinions diverged quite a bit. Some thought that they should have a much larger role, others a much smaller role. And we also heard that there was a sort of a bit of a lack of transparency in terms of their role, but also in terms of being able to have sort of a similar shared conversation about whether they were effective or not, with a number of people saying that they don't know the number of people who were appointed to positions that came through OB. The evaluation of candidates has improved a lot in recent years, and that is not just based on our talking to people, but individuals who have firsthand knowledge of the evaluation processes throughout these years have also said something similar. In terms of not always evaluating candidates in a consistent manner, we heard a number of people express that the processes weren't always institutionalized or transparent. And equally important, that there wasn't always a specific set of criteria against which to rank a candidate. And finally, we heard from people that the Nomcom members themselves could use more interview training, and some Nomcom members expressed that to us as well. In terms of the role of OB Frankfurt, again, the issues are very similar as to the recruiting OB, but we do note that there was sort of a lack of, or there isn't a lot of dialogue in terms of the recruiting and evaluation, whether that's between the OB firms or between OB and the Nomcom, in terms of trying to refine the recruiting and evaluation phases. So I'll turn it back over to Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew and Will. I'm kind of the bookends of this presentation, so I start it out and I will conclude, and then we'll open it up for questions. But before we get to the questions, I just want to give you a summary of some of our other findings. So this one is related to transparency of the Nomcom, in particular its processes. And something that we heard pretty clearly was that transparency has improved pretty significantly over time. And then when asked, well, how transparent is the Nomcom today, kind of, and where would you like to see it going forward? There, the opinions were a little bit divergent. We heard some people that said, they've kind of maybe even gone too far in terms of their transparency. Others felt that it was just about right. And then there was another group of people who thought that it was still a little bit too much of a black box. And, I think everyone, or at least most people, recognize that great care needs to be taken with the confidentiality of people who apply to the Nomcom, but even among the people who thought it was a little black boxy, they thought they could go a little bit further in terms of just opening up the Nomcom processes. In terms of diversity, so there are geographic diversity requirements with respect to Nomcom's appointees to the board, as I'm guessing many of you know. And we asked most people that we interviewed, and it was a survey question as well, the extent to which there should be potentially other diversity requirements for appointees. And by and large, people said, no, we don't really think so. You really should target kind of high, kind of the quote unquote more qualified candidates over other people, and not really take diversity into that decision-making process. The Nomcom itself was seen as not being particularly diverse, which may not be terribly surprising to those of you who have served on the Nomcom or know about the Nomcom. In particular, there's a little bit of imbalance with respect to gender, but also with respect to region and then organizational affiliation as well of the actual Nomcom members. Moving into, I guess I'll say, more structural elements of the nominating committee itself. Most people thought that the current size, in terms of the number of members, is appropriate. There are certainly trade-offs to having more or fewer people in terms of the workload and coming to a consensus more quickly. But in general, people thought that the number of people that are currently on the Nomcom makes sense. There was some concern that the Nomcom doesn't accurately represent kind of, I would say, kind of ICANN, kind of the composition of ICANN. Some individuals thought that there were certain groups, such as the GNSO, that might be overrepresented on the NOMCOM relative to other groups. Another, and this is kind of the second part of the sentence, there was also some concern over the role of non-voting members on the NOMCOM. There are a couple of individuals who, at least kind of historically, have been allowed to participate in what are called straw polls within the nominee committee, but when the final vote/decision is made, they aren't allowed to vote. And that struck some as a little bit odd or kind of curious. And so some individuals thought that everyone should be a voting member. Other people thought that if you were going, that there should be not, that these members should remain as non-voting members. And if they are, then they also shouldn't participate in these so-called straw polls. In terms of the term length, so NOMCOM appointees currently have one-year terms. And almost everyone that we talked to in the interviews who offered an opinion on this, and then people who also provided a survey response, and this is what this chart is showing here, thought that a more appropriate NOMCOM term would be a longer one, and likely of about 2 years, just because it takes a fair amount of time to get up to speed on kind of how to become a really effective NOMCOM member. And then I think this is we're getting close to the end. So in terms of leadership, so the actual chairs of the nominating committee, people thought that that was really effective. In general, the leaders had been effective themselves, but also that the structure was quite effective, and it was nice to have some institutional memory that kind of moved from year to year. There was a little bit of concern in terms of just whether or not the NOMCOM might need additional staff support, just given kind of the large amount of duties that are kind of put onto ICANN staff currently. And then just briefly in terms of next steps. So this is kind of one of the calls that we're participating in during this month to get feedback and thoughts and reactions to our assessment report. We will then publish a draft final report on March 19th, which will include both our findings and then our recommendations. There's a 40-day comment period, which, as the slide indicates, closes on April 30th of this year, at which point we'll review those comments, incorporate them as it makes sense, and then put together a final report that will be published on June 1st. And with that, I will, I think, pause for the moment, and then Lars or Angie, I don't know if there's anything that you would like to add. If not, we can open up for questions.
I needed to unmute there. No, nothing to add from our side. I think we can move on to question and answers. Thank you.
So I see a question in the chat about longer terms and whether it was asked in the context of multiple terms. It was separate. We asked individual people the length of terms they thought might be most appropriate, and then whether those could be repeated multiple times, or if they thought there should be a requirement, say 2 or 3 years off the NOMCOM before being able to rejoin. So say, for example, in the survey, we have data for each person in sort of the combination of both.
And the interviews were a little bit more freeform. So there, when we got into this discussion of term length and kind of whether there should be multiple terms or not, and if so, how many, we got a lot more kind of, I'd say, detailed information about how those two interacted for the interviewees.
This is Lars. There's another question in the chat box for you, Greg and Andrew. And then after that, I can also talk a little bit maybe about the next steps and how people can also continue to ask questions and contribute to the assessment report. But back to you.
I'm not sure.
I guess I have so with respect to your question, Mark, I guess a little bit more clarification might be helpful, unless, Will, you have some first thoughts on a response. Oh, I see Mark's typing too.
No, I'll wait to clarify.
So Mark, thanks for the clarification. I think that's something that is certainly on our minds in terms of the review and kind of how, because to some extent that also plays into the continuity of processes from year to year and how those processes are kind of maintained and which ones are potentially more open or more likely to evolve over time. Well, I don't know if that kind of comports with your thinking on it.
Yeah,
but
yeah. No, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, the chair tended to have a little bit more experience, obviously, and knowledge in the process, and so tended to drive it. And so we saw the influence of the chair could at times be could be fairly strong, and if there were a bit more consistency, perhaps perhaps one of the things we're thinking about is I don't mean to get too far into recommendations, but how do you narrow the range of conversations that's necessary for the Nomcom to consider, and could a few more things be established from year to year? And that might facilitate how those procedures are communicated.
Great, thanks, Will. I see another question in the chat about whether or not yeah, so go ahead.
Just very quickly, you're already starting, I'm sorry to interrupt. Just for the purpose of the recording, some people might just listen to it. Would you mind reading the questions out that are posted in the chat?
Oh.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So in the chat, we have a question of, did you do any analysis of the work of the Nomcom versus the other paths of appointing in leadership positions, either in the board or the different other councils? And what is the level of alignment between those different paths in terms of process, confidentiality, transparency, et cetera? So we haven't done really much in the way of work. I think most of our points of comparison kind of that we brought into the review have been, in particular, Mark and Will's prior knowledge in terms of what is typical and what's not in terms of how these types of nominating committees perform. What areas stand out maybe a little bit with respect to the Nomcom. I think that's kind of been the primary point of comparison. But you raise an interesting question, and I think it's something we'll certainly consider. Andrew, Will, I don't know if there's anything else that I missed you'd like to add.
No, like you say, we didn't cover that specific comparison of the overall set of practices that individuals are appointed or placed on committees or on the board. And then we got some sense, obviously, in reference to how the Nomcom should emphasize a particular aspect, which is the independence of board members, as being particularly salient. But I think that a little bit more look at the broader context of how people are placed on these could provide some perspective.
All right, this is Lars. Are there any other questions, either on the call or in the chat? I see that Mark is typing again. If anybody who's not in the AC room, feel free, obviously, to speak up if you can't raise your hand in the Adobe Connect room.
So another question there on the chat. Have you looked outside the ICANN and compared what you did with what we did with other organizations similar with same size and activity? Obviously, ICANN is unique, but Mark has a tremendous amount of experience. So yeah, we both of us have pretty consistently thought about what we see in other large multi-stakeholder associations as one of our kind of models. And so we do use that as and that will definitely inform recommendations as we move forward.
So we have a question from Mark, and thank you for that, which reads, are you going to look at the actual process by which selection takes place, reducing more than 100 candidates to a smaller pool to be deep dived and then an even smaller pool to be interviewed? And yes, that's fully kind of in the scope of our review, Mark, and will definitely show up, I think, in the recommendations.
This is Lars again. I'm just going to take this opportunity very quickly because people have asked about recommendation or they've been referred to, and not everybody who's on the call is obviously a member of the review team. Mm-hmm. And since this is a process we've done for the first time in the organizational reviews, I just want to remind everybody that this assessment report that's been published and discussed during this webinar is explicitly void of any recommendations. So the idea is that rather than having a full draft final report published, the first step being just have an assessment report like this one, which points out what does and what doesn't work within the organization under review. And then the next step will be, I think, as the analysis group has already pointed out, for them to propose recommendation once the community has agreed on or has given its feedback on the report. The analysis group has taken that on board for them, for the independent examiner, then to formulate recommendations that will then be included in a draft final report, which will go out for a formal public comment period. And I don't want to move on to the final agenda point, but that's probably something we'll be looking at in April or of this year, depending obviously how the timing lines up. Thank you. And Mark, I think for your question, would you like us to propose a recommendation at this point or defer that? I think to not impede on the independence of the analysis group as the outside independent examiner, I think the course of action here is for them to take back the feedback on this report and then propose their own recommendation that will then be published for public comment. And then obviously it'd be very, very much welcome for you and others in the community to comment on those recommendations and provide feedback on that. I hope that helps. All right, this is Lars again. If there's no further questions or comments at this stage, I'd just like to take this very quickly under agenda item 4, the reminder of the public consultation process. As I just pointed out, this report is not going to go out for formal public comment. Instead, we're doing this public consultation, which includes this webinar. There is a review working party call scheduled at the same time next Thursday or Friday, depending on where you are, as well as the week after. During those calls, they're open for the public. You can sign up for those calls and participate, similarly to what happened during this webinar. The calls will, however, be conducted or driven, rather, by the review working party, providing feedback or comment on the report itself, more of a working session rather than this presentation that we had today. And then there's also been a letter that has been sent out to the leaders of the various SOACs, the stakeholder groups, constituencies, as well as the 5 RALOs. And they have been invited to also provide comments in written form to the report via the Review Working Party mailing list. And obviously, if anybody on this call in a personal capacity or as part of their organization would like to make provide written feedback on the assessment report, they're welcome to do so. If you're not entirely clear how that would work, please reach out to anybody on the Review Working Party or anyone of the supporting staff. All of that you can find on the wiki page as well for this review. We'd be happy to direct you. And I think with that, I'm going to pass over any final words to Greg and Andrew and William.
I don't think there's anything from my end, but just wanted to thank everyone for your time and for your questions, and we look forward to sharing our recommendations with you in a little bit too.
All right, thank you everybody. I hope we'll see many of you during next week's public working group call. Sarah and Yvette, if you can end the recording. Thank you very much, and goodbye everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone.